Hey there, and welcome back to ClearPath Conversations. I'm Mark Bernardin. We just wrapped up a three-part mini-series on the Program Resiliency Plan, a framework that I built to evaluate structural integrity in enterprise accounts before instability becomes visible in traditional metrics. If you haven't listened to episodes 28 through 30, I'd encourage you to go back because a lot of what I'm going to be covering in this series builds on the relationship concepts that we introduced in there. In the last episode, in episode 30, I talked about the difference between a navigation tool and a structural diagnostic. The success plan tells you where you're going. The PRP tells you whether the account is really built to make that journey. But there's a third layer underneath both of those. And it's the hardest one to systematize: the quality of the executive relationship itself. That's what this mini series is about: executive relationships, how they're built, how they're read, how they break down, and how you sustain them through the organizational turbulence that that's a constant in enterprise accounts. We're starting today with a question I think most CSMs don't ask directly enough. What is an executive actually evaluating when a CSM is in the room? I want to start with a story because I think this concept is much clearer in a real situation than in the abstract. Early in my customer success career, I was brought into a meeting with the chief information security officer of a large financial services firm. Now, this was not my account originally. The previous CSM had left, and I had inherited the book, and the relationship at the executive level was shaky. The CISO had agreed to this meeting not because he was enthusiastic about it, but because our account executive had worked so hard to get it on the calendar and he had an hour available. I spent the days before that meeting preparing. I read their annual report. I reviewed every support ticket we had on record. I mapped the stakeholders I knew about and identified the gaps. I built a clean one-page summary of where their deployment stood and what the next 3 months should look like. I was ready. And then I walked into the room and realized something important. None of that preparation was what he was going to evaluate first. He wasn't going to evaluate the quality of my prep work. He was going to evaluate me. Within the first 5 minutes of that conversation, he was forming a judgment about whether I was someone worth his time, whether I understood his world, whether I was going to come in with a slide deck and talk at him for 50 minutes, or whether I was going to have an actual conversation. He asked me one question before I had said anything beyond the pleasantries. He said, "What do you think our biggest risk exposure is right now, given where our deployment stands?" Now, that question was not a request for information. He knew the answer. He had a security team, he had internal data, and he had context that I didn't have access to. What he was asking was whether I had the judgment, the preparation, and the courage to give him a real answer or whether I was going to just deflect, qualify everything, and tell him that I need to follow up. I gave him a real answer. I told him, based on what I could see, that their deployment coverage had a significant gap in one specific environment, and that given their industry's current threat landscape, that gap was where I would focus first if I were in his position. I told him what we could do about it, roughly how long it would take, and what I would need from his team to make it all happen. He leaned back and said, "Okay, you did your homework. Let's talk about that gap." The rest of that meeting was a real conversation. And that account became one of the healthiest in my portfolio. What he was evaluating in that moment was not my PowerPoint. It was my judgment, my preparation, and my willingness to have a direct conversation rather than just a safe one. So let me break down what executives are actually evaluating, because I've had enough of these conversations over the years to see the pattern pretty clearly. The first thing they're evaluating is relevance. Do you understand their world well enough to be useful in it? Now, this is not about memorizing our company's press releases. It's about understanding what they're accountable for, what keeps them up at night, and how your product or your program connects to those things. An executive who manages security risk for a Fortune 100 company is living inside a threat landscape, a regulatory environment, a board reporting cadence, and an internal political structure that most CSMs know almost nothing about. If you walk into that room and speak in product terms rather than business terms, you've already lost the meeting. So, relevance is established before you say your first substantive word. It comes from whether you've done the work to understand their world before you arrive. And executives can tell immediately whether you have. The second thing they're evaluating is credibility. Not your company's credibility, yours. Do you know what you're talking about? Can you give a direct answer to a direct question? Are you willing to say something you're not sure they want to hear? Credibility isn't built through authority or seniority. It's built through demonstrated competence and intellectual honesty. The CSMs that I've seen lose executive credibility the fastest are the ones who overpromise, who can't give a direct answer, or who pivot to marketing language when the conversation gets a little uncomfortable. Executives deal with people who do that all day. They're they're extraordinarily good at identifying it. When you do it, you become one of the many people in their week they don't need to invest time in. The third thing they're evaluating, and this one is rarely named directly, is efficiency. Does being in a meeting with you produce something valuable? Executives don't have time to spare. If they agree to spend an hour with a CSM, they're making a calculation that the hour will be worth more than whatever else they could have done with it. When the meeting doesn't deliver on that calculation, the next invite just doesn't get accepted. Now, efficiency means you have a clear point and that you make it and you listen. You come to some form of resolution or next step. You don't meander. You don't narrate your own slides, and you don't fill silence with words that don't add anything. And the fourth thing, the one that determines whether the relationship deepens over time, is trust. Not likability, trust. The question underneath this one is, if something goes wrong, will this person tell me the truth? Will they protect my interests, not just their vendor's interests? Will they show up with the same posture when things are hard as they do when things are fine? Trust at the executive level is built slowly, but lost very quickly. Every interaction either adds to it or draws from it. And the CSMs who build the deepest executive relationships are the ones who are consistent. Same energy, the same directness, the same commitment to honesty, regardless of whether the news is good. I want to give you a framework for thinking about how to enter an executive meeting, because I think the practical application of this is where most CSMs get stuck. Before any executive interaction, I ask myself 4 questions. What does this person care about right now that I can speak to credibly? What is the one thing I want them to take away from this conversation? What is the most direct path to getting there? And what might they push back on, and how will I respond? That last question is the one most people skip. They prepare for the conversation they hope to have. They don't prepare for the conversation the executive might redirect them into. And when that happens, when an executive asks something unexpected or challenges an assumption or just pivots the topic entirely, unprepared CSMs either freeze or they retreat into safe, vague language. The ability to respond to an unexpected executive question with composure and substance is one of the most valuable skills you can develop in this career. It comes from preparation, yes, but it also comes from having thought carefully enough about the account, the customer's business, their challenges, their stakeholder dynamics, that you can engage authentically, even when the conversation goes somewhere that you didn't anticipate. That kind of engagement is what executives remember, not the slide deck, the conversation. One more thing before we close, because I think this is worth saying directly. The executives you're trying to build relationships with are busy, skeptical, and frequently disappointed by the vendor interactions in their calendar. They have been overpromised, underdelivered, and sold things that they didn't need by people who were polished and confident. They're not naive about the vendor relationship, and they are not going to give you their trust just because you seem nice. What they will give you, what they've given me in some of the most important relationships in my career, is engagement. Real engagement where they actually talk to you as someone who can add value to their thinking. But you earn that by demonstrating relevance, credibility, efficiency, and consistency, not by asking for it. The irony of executive relationship building is that the CSMs who try the hardest to build executive relationships often struggle the most because they're visibly trying. And the ones who succeed are the ones who focus entirely on delivering value in every interaction and let the relationship build as a byproduct. In our next episode, we're going to tackle the scenario that most enterprise CSMs face at some point in a major account. You need executive access that nobody gave you. Your day-to-day contact is the ceiling, and you need to figure out how to build upward without burning the relationship you have. That's a nuanced situation, and there are a lot of ways of getting it wrong. We'll talk through what actually works. So follow the show on your favorite platform. Connect with me on LinkedIn at linkedin.com/in/Mark Bernardin. And if you're heading into an executive meeting this week and something in this episode shifted how you're thinking about your preparation, I'd genuinely love to hear how it goes. Thank you for being here. Thank you for doing this work. And thank you for showing up and delivering every single day. I'll talk to you soon.